former candidate for the U.S. Senate, longtime radio talk show host, author, and conservative policy advocate.
Justices to the Supreme Court, the left has been in open panic.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
How long will it last? How many will die? Will America ever return to normal? Let's face it, those are the questions on almost everyone's mind as we take another step deeper into this strange new corona world. Welcome back into Liberty Nation Radio, a production of LibertyNation.com and heard from coast to coast on the Radio America Network. Today we'll offer some new and different angles on this coronavirus story, effectively the only story there is other than satellite stories which revolve around it. LibertyNation.com military affairs contributor Dave Patterson on the Defense Production Act invoked by President Trump and whether the CEO of General Motors has only reluctantly performed his patriotic duty. Scott Cosenza on matters affecting your liberty during this crisis, and there's almost too many to name. San Francisco bans reusable bags, businesses suing the government over a coronavirus closure order, government delays in new mask-making facilities, and more.
Say what? Say what? Say what? One more time.
We kick things off with our signature segment, Say What, where we roll out a virtual assembly line of wacky, astonishing, and damnable things that are most revealing about politicians and the chattering class. We're coming up fast on 1 month since President Trump first sounded the corona alarm, and at least now we can talk about this with some modicum of perspective, at least through the glass, if darkly, and try to figure out when we might wake up from this nightmare. But we still don't know if it's 2 a.m. and the nightmare goes on for several more hours before we wake up, or if it's closer to 6 a.m. We're told this thing will peak by about tax day, April 15th, some kind of perfect irony there, and then begin to subside, but not, we're told, until somewhere between 100 and 240,000 Americans will die. And then, without a vaccine, it could come back when the weather gets cool again in the fall. But 100 to 240,000 deaths. Now, that's a big number to be sure. But for perspective, let's remember that 60,000 people died in 2017 alone from the flu. Credible experts agree that the corona toll could have been in the 2 million range with no intervention or mitigation, the kind of social distancing we're all doing now. And even at the upper range of that estimated death toll, 240,000, it represents 0.07% of the U.S. population, which is about 330 million people. At the low end, 100,000 deaths, it would be 0.03% of the population. Again, for perspective, 1% of the population would be 3 million. Now, numbers aren't great on radio, but you get the idea. Even those high-end estimates represent a relatively minuscule portion of our population. But the political climate surrounding corona has now all but reverted back to the same partisan poison before the outbreak. Democrats' chief talking point is, cleverly, something that can't be proved or disproved, much like conspiracy theories, that Trump's response was too slow and that will cost lives. Yes, it's Trump's fault, of course, and this is just another in a long line of Trump scandals, as Democrats see it, another impeachable offense. Trump responded by saying he was distracted during the initial outbreak in January by the Ukraine impeachment thing, a charge which the Democrat leader, Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi, said is deeply disturbing.
I think that's an admission that perhaps the president and the majority leader cannot handle the job. We have a life and death situation in our country, and they should not try to hide behind an excuse for why they did not take action, but it does admit that they did not take action. But that's for an after-action review down the road. Right now, We have to work together to get the job done. But what we had in our House bill, which was rejected by the Senate in this most recent bill, was directing the president to implement the Defense Production Act.
So the Democrat leader calls for full implementation of the Defense Production Act by calling it the Defense Protection Act. Can't even get the name of what she's demanding straight. And goes full-on political in the midst of a national health crisis. And now she says she'll, what else? Begin an investigation into Trump's conduct during the corona crisis. You know, in some sense, it's nice to know for the sake of stability that while most of the world has changed in this crisis, the Democrats have not. Another tentacle of the Democrats' political offensive against a president trying to fight off a killer virus is the growing complaints about his daily press briefings, which give him national TV exposure every day at the dinner hour with everyone home everywhere. So, in the left's one-step thinking, best to simply stop covering them. And leading the band on that is one of the high-profile members of the Trump-deranged media, and as I like to call him, the most appropriately named man on TV, CNN's Don Lemon.
I don't think that you should really listen to what he says. You should listen to what the experts say. I'm not actually sure, if you want to be honest, that we should carry that live. I think we should run snippets. I think we should do it afterwards and get the pertinent points to the American people, because he's never, ever going to tell you the truth.
So Don Lemon and his cohorts in the Trump-deranged media believe the way to help in the crisis is to call the president, the only president we have during this crisis, like it or not, a liar. Yeah, that's helpful. Democrats didn't even do that to George W. Bush after 9/11. And Joe Biden jumped aboard the Corona Attack Trump train as well with the unveiling of his new podcast, which we'll discuss a bit later in the show. But one of the things that really snapped people to attention during this crisis was famous people getting the virus. Among them, another of the most Trump-deranged anchors on CNN and brother of the New York governor, Chris Cuomo.
We do not have the testing data to make real sense of our reality beyond what we know is the face of it for an overwhelming number who get sick. And that face is mine. I tested positive. Scary. Yes, as you might imagine, but better me than you. My concern is what I may have put on my family, just like you would. That is hurting me way more than anything a virus can do. So let's focus. Let's use this example of me having it as proof that you can get it too, God forbid.
And the list of famous people and celebrities who now have the virus continues to grow. Actor Tom Hanks and wife Rita Wilson, basketball star Kevin Durant, British Prime Minister Boris Johnson, even Prince Charles.
Having recently gone through the process of contracting this coronavirus, luckily with relatively mild symptoms, I now find myself on the other side of the illness, but still in no less a state of social distance and general isolation. As we're all learning, this is a strange, frustrating and often distressing experience when the presence of family and friends is no longer possible and the normal structures of life are suddenly removed.
You know, the fact that this virus struck down the future King of England should teach all of us a lesson in humility about ourselves. Talk about humble. From Prince Charles on down to the homeless man on the street, all of mankind has been thwarted by a virus from a bat. A virus from a bat. If that doesn't humble you, nothing will. And we'll be back to discuss the response of private industry to the corona crisis and how the president had to use some serious leverage to get General Motors, for one, to do the right thing.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
The current CEO of General Motors, GM, is no William Knudsen, When called upon by President Roosevelt to coordinate the retooling of the auto industry to World War II production of massive amounts of armaments, Big Bill Knudsen, CEO of GM from 1937 to 40, rose to the occasion. The current CEO, well, not so much. So begins an article on LibertyNation.com entitled General Motors, Where's Your World War II Spirit? By the newest and most welcome addition to the Liberty Nation family, Dave Patterson, military affairs contributor and former principal deputy undersecretary of defense. It takes us back, this does, to the days when the nation pulled together in a time of war, which is essentially where we are right now, except the enemy is a virus instead of a Nazi dictator. And Dave Patterson joins us now. Dave, welcome aboard.
Tim, it's great to be with you.
Well, better to have you. Let me start with a broad question. How would you compare the response of the nation's business leaders in this corona crisis to the response 75 years ago during World War II?
I think I'd characterize our business leaders today as cautiously eager to help, in what is clearly a pandemic crisis. Not to point out the obvious, but we live in an entirely different world than our fathers and grandfathers did. Large companies, quite frankly, are global in their business interests and have perceived their obligations as important outside of America. That was not the case 75 years ago.
Indeed. America first, putting America first, was hardly a controversial idea in 1940. Now, President Trump has invoked the Defense Production Act, but has not yet actually put it into practice. Explain for us what powers the Defense Production Act gives the president, whether and in what situations it's likely he'll have to employ it, and how the CEO of GM was slow to answer the emergency call to produce not cars but ventilators.
Well, I think that you have a very good question there. Yeah, last Friday, President Trump did invoke the Defense Production Acts, specifically to compel General Motors, as the president put it, to accept, perform, and prioritize federal contracts for ventilators. Now, the DPA also fortifies the president's authority to do other things, like prosecute those who engage in price gouging and hoarding, for example, which has happened frequently during this crisis. Now, President Trump was authorized to do this because he had met the standard, the legal standard, by declaring ventilators and protective equipment as essential to the national defense.
Is it reasonable to conclude that the president invoked the Defense Production Act just in order to give himself the leverage to force businesses to repurpose and produce vital supplies and equipment? Or do you get the sense he'll actually have to use this most intrusive of government interventions into the private sector?
Well, I think initially President Trump was, as he said, reluctant to invoke DPA because, as you say, this is a very intrusive tool and intrusive into the business of the private sector. President Trump said that he hoped it would not be necessary. But I think that we can agree that President Trump is not a patient man. And when it appeared as though GM was not negotiating the price of the ventilators with a sense of urgency and more business as usual, he acted. I think we should applaud him for that.
Well, the elite media is hardly doing that, but then what else is new? Now, from your article specifically, Dave, on the issue of patriotism in America's 21st century business community, if you asked this question in your article, if the United States faces the prospect of increasing its industrial-based production to meet the challenge of a significant defense crisis, could or would the GMs, Fords, Apples, and Googles do it? How would you answer that question?
Well, it's not clear to me that it would be their first instinct, as much as I regret saying that. In 2011, for example, President Obama actually invoked the DPA against the telecommunications industry. And he threatened them with criminal penalties in order to get detailed information on what foreign countries were supplying in terms of hardware and software for their networks. And he did this in an effort to thwart Chinese cyber attacks.
How do you think the ever fewer remaining members of what we call the greatest generation, the generation that fought and won essentially 2 world wars, one to the east, the other to the west, how would they view America's response to a crisis that could be the most threatening since World War II?
You know, Tim, I believe that they would be disappointed. Not that companies today haven't stepped up in this crisis, because many have. They would be disappointed in the private sector generally, and I believe in our government specifically, for letting the country get into this deplorable condition. You know, we're being held hostage to foreign suppliers for critical products that are essential in national emergencies. China provides the propellant for Hellfire missiles, for example, and we use those in our efforts against terrorists. And how in the world did we get into the position of where China provides over 90% of our most common and necessary antibiotics, vitamins, and other pharmaceuticals? This has to be turned around. Get into this perverse situation where we get into a military conflict with China and need their help to win.
And that about says it right there. And of all the things that are going to change when all this is over, our relationship with China has to be at the top of the list. Dave, thanks for joining us.
Hey, thank you, Tim. I appreciate being with you.
Dave Patterson, military affairs contributor for LibertyNation.com. Quick break, and then we're back to discuss Joe Biden's latest shot in the dark.
Where can you find honest political commentary? With sobering analysis.
Even the most trusting among us may find a company's latest plan deeply intrusive.
Accountability.
Perhaps it's time to start asking the right questions.
Deconstructing threats to our liberty.
Unparalleled insight into important stuff.
And boldly reporting the truth. Truth is making a comeback.
Well, hello again, and welcome to Election 2020 Roundtable.
Uprising podcast of LibertyNation.com.
Abortion is functionally sexist.
From my cold, dead hand.
Subscribe to the LibertyNation.com YouTube channel, where facts matter.
Click on youtube.com/LibertyNation.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Well, he tried retail campaigning, wholesale campaigning, town halls, virtual town halls, YouTube videos, appeals for a return to the salad days of Obama and his own glory days in the Senate, promising the party base that he really is a progressive. Nothing worked. But after stepping to the side and looking on as competing candidates were shown the door at just the right moment by party elites, thus essentially being handed the nomination, Joe Biden has a problem. It's called exposure. With the COVID crisis consuming our lives, people are simply not paying attention to presidential politics or much of anything else for that matter. So now, Joe Biden's latest shot in the dark is a podcast. Here's the Deal, debuted this week, produced by the Biden campaign as the presumptive and quarantined nominee desperately attempts to gain a measure of visibility during a time when his opponents on national TV speaking on matters of great importance at the dinner hour almost every day.
I think this podcast could offer some really helpful information. I've seen these kinds of crises before, and I've sat in the Situation Room in the Oval Office, and we've grappled with crises from Ebola outbreak to the Iran nuclear deal to the auto industry rescue. And during that time, I've been able to work with some pretty accomplished experts, women and men who have steered us through epidemics, pandemics, some of the most complex problems that this country could possibly face, and people who provide some advice and logic and information on the coronavirus crisis that we're facing. So each week what I'm going to try to do is be joined by one of those experts, someone who can offer us some helpful information. Then the two of us will answer questions from you. And our first episode, I'm going to be joined by Ron Klain.
By now, most everyone, including Biden's campaign managers, of course, understand that he must be put in a controlled environment whenever possible. And to say this podcast was tightly controlled and edited would be an understatement, to the point where it amounts to little more than a campaign commercial. And to paraphrase that line Lloyd Benson pulled on Dan Quayle, having been on the Liberty Nation podcast, The Uprising, for years, Mr. Biden, I know podcasts, and that's no podcast. Now, having edited audio for many more years than I care to remember, an informal personal account on Here's the Deal would put the count at about 50 edits, many of them abrupt. Now, I want you to listen carefully to this 29-second clip with 7 or 8 edits, some of them really clunky.
Ron is an outside advisor to my campaign. He led the Ebola response in President Obama's and my administration in 2014. And so he's going to talk to us about a few things. First, about how President Trump downplays this crisis, how he has rattled public confidence and delayed our country's response. Next, we'll talk a bit about my plan with the federal government, what they should be doing now. When I say now, I mean immediately to combat this crisis. And finally, take on some questions from our listeners.
Now, we'll get to the content in there, but why do I focus on the edits? Because the guy is running for president and he can't get through a scripted, simple, informal, 30-second happy talk, scripted opening to his podcast without 7 or 8 takes. What does that say about his ability to withstand the cauldron of a presidential race against Donald Trump? And here's the other point. Some of the edits, as you heard, were so poorly executed, which reveals, again, the baffling technological incompetence of the Biden campaign, which may well reveal more far-reaching incompetence, and the difficulty in trying to package a candidate who must be held on such a short leash. But at least in this case, because the podcast was recorded and heavily edited, it did not feature the type of live stream meltdowns that have recently characterized the Biden campaign. Now, I love when Biden said in that last clip that he'll take some questions from his listeners, take some questions from our listeners in his first podcast, meaning there haven't been any listeners. Wow. So as the former vice president transmits from his home, stuck there like a teenager in his parents' basement, by promising to speak with experts on the coronavirus, and then brings on Ron Klain, as you heard, a political hack, his longtime chief of staff, never identified as such, by the way, to obediently call him Mr. Vice President over and over, while asking and answering planned questions from demographically correct young voters, the kind who flocked to Bernie Sanders while avoiding Biden like the plague before the whole nominating process was frozen. So Biden asked questions of his political advisor as if the guy's some kind of expert on coronavirus, the kind that he promised to produce in the opening of the podcast, and as if the question and answer had not been scripted in advance.
Is there a shortage of testing, and why does that exist if there is?
Well, this is one of the biggest problems we've seen with the coronavirus response. As you've said, Mr. Vice President, the coronavirus isn't Donald Trump's fault, but how we responded to it is, and there's no issue that illustrates that more than this testing fiasco. Donald Trump didn't take the steps needed to get the testing in place. As a result, compared to almost every other developed nation, we're behind on getting people tested. That problem falls squarely on the shoulders of President Trump and his administration.
Again, I just love how he repeatedly calls him Mr. Vice President. That's very funny. Biden says more than once he won't make the podcast political and then repeatedly engages in naked political attacks. He calls for people to come together at this time saying, quote, "I'm so proud we are working together," while ripping President Trump's handling of the crisis. He says in one breath that Trump has rattled the public's confidence, and in the next says the president has lied about the crisis, never specifying exactly how. Don't you love how Klain repeats Biden's deeply reassuring statement that the deadly virus is not Trump's fault? Whew, that's a relief. But of course, the response to it is, however, it can be said in all this that the former vice president's hindsight in a time of crisis is 2020. We could aptly employ the expression Monday morning quarterback if we ever again remember what that once meant. The presumptive Democratic presidential nominee also spoke of his predictably government-centric alternative plan for handling the crisis, touting his own panel of one-time experts. More federal spending, more regulations, more reliance on global institutions like the World Health Organization, less on private industry, all the time creating a transparently political veil to drape over this crisis. Folks, let's be clear about why Joe Biden finally hit a hot streak. It was by doing nothing. Indeed, as the threat of Bernie Sanders actually becoming the nominee grew menacing after the socialist senator won the first 3 presidential nomination contests, the former vice president simply stood aside and watched as his party's elites quickly ran every other non-Bernie candidate out of the race, leaving Biden alone as the last man standing. Thus, they put a virtual gun to the head of Democratic voters, essentially forcing them to choose someone who was roundly written off, and for understandable, if not good reasons, because, well, this is the guy who the elites have selected to carry their water. Folks, this is the same Joe Biden who months ago was marked as a man in noticeable decline and was written off largely because of it. He has not suddenly stopped declining. He did not suddenly find a message. He did not suddenly find his footing. He did absolutely nothing to stir his own rise from the political dead. And the Here's the Deal podcast, the Biden campaign's latest shot in the dark, will likely do little or nothing to enhance the image of a man who voters will be learning an awful lot about in the months ahead. And we'll be back with Talkin' Liberty.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
And now we welcome you to the portion of Liberty Nation Radio, which we entitle Talkin' Liberty. And, you know, there's a great deal in the way of threats to liberty these days, and who better to enumerate them for us than our legal affairs contributor, constitutional lawyer, and the man we call our guardian of individual liberty, Scott Cosenza. Hello, Scott.
Hello, Tim. I am here to be the Debbie Downer of the of the segment. Yes.
But we need to know what to be down about. And let's
where
start.
The attacks are coming. The only way we can rebuff them is if we know where they're coming from, and that hopefully is a valuable function.
Exactly. And it's a time of peril for people who love liberty because it's so easily given away in a time of crisis. In San Francisco, they have banned reusable grocery bags. Now, this may not be the worst thing in the world, but it does reduce individual liberty while supposedly improving public health.
That's the point of the story, Tim, is that we talked on this program not a year ago, I think, about them banning the plastic ones. Remember, that was what was going to save the planet. The plastic straws and the plastic bags had to go. You're like Charlie Manson if you walked around with a plastic bag.
Hey, ho, ho, plastic bags have got to go.
I think it was 5 years ago, maybe 3 years ago, I was in Toronto. on a trip, and I bought a shirt, and they asked me if I wanted a bag, and I said yeah, and they rang it up like, I forget how much it was. It was a nickel or a quarter. And I thought, no, I didn't mean I wanted to buy one, sir. I just wished for my garment that I just purchased to be placed in one. Well, that's what happens in a lot of these places where the progressives took hold, and in spite of the fact that plastic bags don't actually contribute that much to overall waste, and also they have a great health benefit, a safety health benefit, which is that raw food, which often contains harmful microbes, not to mention things like viruses that can live on these things for a while, go away when these bags are disposed of. So we railed against what we thought were short-sighted bans on the plastic bags, and I think this is just the chickens coming home to roost here, where now they can't abide the reusables.
Let's move on to businesses suing the government over a coronavirus closure order. What's this about?
Well, Tim, we have had and talked about the case of gun stores suing who were not included on the lists of emergency keep open type businesses, where they're allowed to stay open. And we talked about abortion clinics also, which have sued. And by and large, they both will be allowed to operate in the states. But what we haven't talked about are like non-essential businesses, because those involve fundamental rights, as the Supreme Court has defined them. And what about just a regular business that does not involve any enumerated fundamental right, like the right to keep and bear arms, or a judicially crafted fundamental right, like the right to privacy in abortion services, which the Supreme Court has done? This is a business that sells bells, Tim, hand bells and other types of bells, like you might experience if you go to church, especially during Christmas time, and they have these bell ringing. And I know that you do know what I mean, because I have been to the ringing of the bells with you in a church.
I do.
At Christmas
That's
time.
True, you did.
And it's quite lovely. And the problem is that they can't produce their bells. Schulmerich Bells is a Pennsylvania bells manufacturer in Hatfield, PA, and they've challenged Governor Tom Wolf's order that they not be able to remain open. They haven't said that they intend to remain open and flaunt what we might now consider common safety rules with COVID-19. So they don't seem to be irresponsible. They're just saying you can't give us a blanket shutdown order based on your say-so without any due process. There's been no finding that bell company can't operate safely within the COVID-19 protocols, for instance. And so I think this is we're going to see more suits like this, and we're going to pay attention and see what happens.
I think one of the cutting-edge issues surrounding this coronavirus subject, Scott, is, you remember when Bill Clinton said famously, it depends what the meaning of his is. I think we're going to be debating what the meaning of essential is, because essential businesses are the only ones that are going to be allowed to operate probably in all 50 states sooner rather than later.
Well, we'll see what the courts say about that, Tim.
Indeed, we will, as we always do. And speaking of the courts, a federal court says that violating a site's terms of service isn't criminal hacking. Praise God, a story not about coronavirus.
Well, this is a great story, Tim, for liberty, I think, because what has happened is that prosecutors tried to turn the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, which is the sort of primary anti-hacking law in America, into people who would just violate a site's terms of service. And the problem, making it a crime. And it's really quite, I think, shocking to the conscience that you could say, like, let's say, for instance, that a website said you have to be a resident of the 50 states before you could access it for some reason that they wished, and you weren't, and you accessed the website anyway or signed up for an account. I think that there are many Americans, Tim, whose minors have accounts at Facebook and other places where maybe they're not allowed to. They lie and say that they're older or something like that. Or maybe the opposite. Maybe there's a site designed for children and marketed for children, and an older person decides they want to see what's going on that site, so they lie and say they're a young person. Well, those things are not crimes, just like lying to somebody in person isn't a crime. Fraud is still a crime. So this isn't about fraud. I want to make that clear. This is just about whether you can access a website and violate the terms of service and not be penalized criminally.
Okay, after a thankful but quick trip down a bunny trail other than the coronavirus, we go back to COVID-19, Scott, and the feds say it'll take up to 90 days to approve new mask-making facilities.
Tim, I think it's important that we always try to recognize, when people are being demonized. We've talked about the hoarding and the profiteering challenges on the show before, but the people who are in charge of seeing that these masks, from the governmental perspective, are out there, both the Centers for Disease Control and the FDA, are not doing what they can to bring them to market. And in addition to allowing speculation in the marketplace with respect to price, which I think, the facts demonstrate will only bring more masks to market, the other thing is they're hobbling the ones that are out there right now and could be brought in due to fealty to a regulation. And, we do have, the reason why we have things like battle overrides and emergency declarations, I think, is to bear witness to the fact that we're not in ordinary times, and perhaps that the lengthy approval process, even though I don't agree it makes sense in other times, that it doesn't make sense now.
Do you even remember what ordinary times were like, Scott?
It seems like a while ago.
Doesn't it? Now, in a story that kind of blends ordinary times with the crisis we're in now, the Trump administration has scrapped the Obama fuel efficiency standard and opt for a more lax rule. That's something I think that the Trump administration wanted to do anyway, but now they figure they want to do anything they can to boost a struggling auto industry.
I think the big industry people are actually against this move by the Trump administration. And I think it is a case of rent-seeking and protection by big businesses against smaller business. And what I mean by that is, if you're running a high-volume business, Tim, then the compliance cost can be folded into each unit, and the higher that compliance cost is, it benefits you against a producer who is a much lower volume level, right? Because the cost per unit to increase to comply with these rules. It's one of the reasons why we have large companies oftentimes in league with government to increase barriers to entry into the marketplace through increased regulations. And this is about the corporate average fuel economy standards. Government regulates these things and puts these targets and makes companies and punishes companies if they don't meet those targets. The Trump administration has said that the increase in mandated efficiency will be dialed way back. So there's only going to be a small increase in mandated efficiency. Now, Tim, the pro-freedom perspective says, hey, if you want to buy an electric car or a Prius or a hybrid or a gas guzzler, those are your priorities, and you should be able to meet them along with any market participant that meets your needs. So you should be able to buy a Tesla if you want, or you should be able to buy the gas guzzler car if you want.
Thank you, Scott.
Thanks, Tim.
This program, Liberty Nation Radio and LibertyNation.com's own podcasts, The Uprising, hosted by Scott, and The Rabbit Hole, Politics and Prose, where past is prologue, all available on demand at LibertyNation.com. So that is it for this week, but we'll be back at you next week, same time, same station. Till then, stand up for liberty and for heaven's sake, stay well. We'll see you next time on Liberty Nation Radio.